Infrastructure by its very nature is long-term. So it's not something that can be done if you look at the big projects in a couple of weeks or couple of months. So it tends to be long-term, and historically it has tended to be done by governments, by the public sector. However, that is changing, and rightly so. And we have the private sector getting more and more involved. But the first thing, of course, is that it's got to be long-term funding. If it's short-term, then you run into all sorts of problems with regards to looking for your returns in a very short time, and that might not happen. So if we look at our own region at the moment, we've got a classic example that's just happened or that's happening, which I'm sure PPC is probably involved in doing, the Beitbridge border post. The Beitbridge border post is actually a private sector, although it's Zim government, it's actually being funded by the 4 big banks in South Africa. And it's a very, very good example of how the private sector can play a very important or pivotal role in the development of infrastructure. Private sector are in business to make a profit, and they've got shareholders who hold them to account. I'm sure Roland can tell you a million things around that. So you also have to make sure that the way that funding is structured makes sense. In a Zim type context, you also have to make sure that you put in place all the wills, bits and pieces to make sure that the risk attached to that project are actually addressed and addressed fully. And I think without going into detail, the Beitbridge project actually does that. So there is money that can come from the private sector to fund these big ticket infrastructure projects, but it has to make sense. You have to make sure that all the different risks, whether it's exchange control risk, as we see it in a lot of the African countries, there are exchange control regulations, and you need to be able to pay for that debt, not in Zim dollars, but in US dollars. So you need to make sure that everything to cover some of those risks are put in place in your documentation. And that's where the legal side, the governments as well, come into play. So we're looking at the private sector to fund infrastructure. We're looking at the public sector to fund infrastructure, but we are also looking at DFIs. DFIs like CDC, NoFund, are very good at what our term patient capital, where they put in money into infrastructure and the returns take long to get back to them. They're in a position to be able to do that, and I think we need to make very good use of the DFIs, and there are plenty of them. And it's long-term funding that we can find. And when you look at a lot of the international banks, they're also in a position to fund infrastructure on our continent, as long as all the boxes are ticked.